Hear the word of the Lord from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 6, 15 through 17. When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The situation at Pilate's headquarters is escalating. As we heard last week, the Jewish high officials had brought Jesus to Pilate early in the morning and waited outside as Pilate questioned him. Pilate, probably annoyed at the disturbance, reluctantly talks to Jesus and can't figure out what's going wrong or what Jesus did to end up here. So he goes back to the Jewish officials and tries to get Jesus released. But instead of releasing an innocent man, they choose to free Barabbas. Now Pilate is in a sticky spot. He thinks Jesus is innocent, and even more than that, he thinks Jesus might have some kind of divine power. After all, the officials say Jesus claimed to be the King of the Jews, the Son of God. So he decides to try another method to get Jesus released, by making him look as weak, as unkingly and ungodlike as possible. He hands him over to Roman soldiers to be beaten and mocked, to dress him up in a cheap purple robe and a fake crown that leaves his face covered in scratches and bleeding. This is where our story for today opens. Pilate pushes Jesus outside to stand in front of the priests and officers, covered in blood, wearing what amounts to no more than a silly costume. Surely the Jewish officials will see how little of a threat Jesus is to them now. But no. Instead, they become even angrier and angrier, more insistent, yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." Finally, Pilate exclaims in desperation, "But shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests, the Jewish religious leaders who run the temple, who teach Jewish people how to follow God, who are supposed to believe in a higher law and a higher authority, say, "We have no king but the emperor." It is a profound denial of their God, the God of Israel, the God who is supposed to be their highest authority and king. And yet we know that in the context of the Roman Empire, perhaps this is what the Jewish authorities felt they had to say in order to survive. The chief priests know they have power in the temple and among the Jewish people only because the Roman emperor allows them to. To keep their power, their jobs, even their lives, they must constantly display how loyal they are to the empire. If there is even the smallest whisper of rebellion or revolt among the Jewish people, the chief priests must stomp it out, or else they will lose everything. They're even trying to protect their people, who would suffer great harm and perhaps even expulsion from their homeland if a rebel like Jesus led them in revolt against the empire. They cannot allow Jesus to continue threatening them and their safety by demanding people's loyalty to God's kingdom rather than to Rome. And so they threaten Pilate with the violent power of the Roman Empire, saying, "If you are truly loyal to the king, as we are, you will crucify this man Jesus, like you would crucify any other rebel." Because Pilate, too, is in a position of power granted by the empire. He knows that if the Emperor Caesar thinks he's disloyal, he can be executed, crucified on the side of the road like any other dissenter. So he, like the priests, must prove his loyalty to Rome. We see these two powers go back and forth, as Pilate goes outside to the priests and inside to Jesus, and back outside to the priests again. Pilate is trying to free Jesus, to get Jesus to say something, anything, that will prove his innocence and allow Pilate to wash his hands of this messy business. But Jesus says nothing. These powers that be will determine whether he lives or dies. It is not Jesus' choice to make. He is caught in the middle of their power struggle. These powers have their own interests in mind. They know that to keep their power, they must denounce any king other than the emperor. It is for this reason that they ultimately decide to send Jesus, this King of the Jews, to the cross. They make their decision out of fear, out of self-preservation. We know powers like this too, don't we? We know leaders and corporations and governments and institutions that make decisions based on what is best for them, what allows them to stay in control, what demonstrates their faithfulness to the systems that keep them in power, systems of whiteness and patriarchy and money. And we know the feeling that powers far beyond our reach are making vital decisions about our lives. The decisions of corrupt leaders like Putin, who struggles for land and power, result in the displacement and death of people who have no say. Or powers like governors or state legislatures that decide to take away the rights of queer and trans kids to access life-saving health care, to participate on sports teams, to be represented in the classroom. Or even the corporate executives who hold so much power over not only how much they damage the earth that we depend on for our lives, but also have the power to decide whether to pay their employees enough to afford health care, therapy, housing, food. We live in a time where the powers that be go back and forth, and we are caught in the middle. We feel helpless and afraid. How can we know what the future holds? Will our future be safe? We don't know what Jesus is thinking or feeling as he watches these powers go back and forth, deciding his fate, his life in their hands. Other people have pushed him around, into Pilate's courtyard, inside Pilate's headquarters, back outside to be beaten by Roman soldiers, and then he is sent to walk alone, carrying the cross he knows he will die on. John's account of this is unique from the other Gospels. All the other Gospels depict Jesus as too weak at this point to carry his own cross. A person named Simon carries it for him. Yet John tells the story differently. Perhaps this isn't surprising. The author of John seems much more interested than the other Gospel writers in depicting Jesus as divine, strong, supernatural. Perhaps for John, Jesus needing help carrying the cross seems too human. But I think the story John tells is actually deeply human. In this story, Jesus bears a heavy cross alone. With every step he takes, he can feel the bite of the wood on his back, and he knows he is going to die. I have to imagine that with each step, with each aching breath, with each slip of the cross on his shoulders, memories are flashing through his mind, one after the other, so vivid he can almost touch them. His hands in the dirt as he played with his brothers outside his childhood home. The slap of the waters of the Galilee against the rocks where he sat with his friends in the sunshine, laughing. The taste of sweet, good wine at his friend's wedding, and the sparkle in his mother's eyes because she knew exactly where that wine came from. The cool waters of the Jordan River enclosing him like a tomb, and the feeling of his cousin John's rough hand on his back, raising him up, feeling the burning of air in his lungs again as if it were for the first time. The trembling of his arms as he hugged his friend Lazarus, fresh out of the tomb, and the hot tears on his face. The softness of bread broken in his hand, the stinging bittersweetness of the wine. His friends' faces surrounding him, the candlelight casting moving shadows on his face, and the face of Judas, of love betrayed. Jesus knows he's going to die, and he has a slow and painful walk to remember all he is losing, all the joys of being alive, the feeling of having a human body walking on this earth, of everything there is to touch, to taste, to see. This kind of loss is something we all face in more or less obvious ways. We have all this beauty and richness of our lives, our bodies, and the world, our relationships, and sometimes these things come to an end. Sometimes we have the diagnosis and we know death is coming soon. Sometimes we are in our 20s and certain that death can never touch us. And yet the news around the world over the last couple of years has made us all feel a little more uncertain, our lives a little less stable. The powers that be do not play fair. Like Jesus, when we know that we are about to face loss or that something important in our lives is going to die, we begin grieving before the loss even occurs. This is what psychologists today call anticipatory grief, the grief we experience before we experience a loss. Sometimes if the journey to loss is long and drawn out, anticipatory grief can feel even worse than the grief we feel after the loss has already occurred. Perhaps we know death is coming soon, or perhaps we know that a divorce is just around the corner. Perhaps we know that our time at a job we love is coming to an end, or we are moving away from our home and our community, or a close relationship is ending. It is in these moments that we are flooded with memories of the way things were before, the way we know that soon they will never be again. Sometimes this grief comes out as anger, other times it comes out as depression. I know for me that when the end is coming but hasn't come yet, that's when I get frantic. I try with everything that is in me, every resource I have at my disposal, to find a way to stop the loss from happening. If I can just get this person to listen to me, they'll stay. If I can just pull out the right emotional appeal, my family will stay together. If I can just find the right doctor, the right hospital. What strikes me about this story is that Jesus isn't frantic. He's quiet. He doesn't struggle. When Pilate asks him to defend himself, he says nothing. He could do so many things. Deny that he is king, convince Pilate to leverage his power, remind the chief priests of their duties to God. Jesus is God, after all. Could he not easily slip out of their grasp? But he tries none of these strategies. Instead, he seems to have some sort of inner certainty that this death is what he must suffer. And if God is the bigger power than either Pilate or the priests, or even death itself, then certainly there is something on the other side. Certainly there will be goodness and life again. Jesus has already predicted his own death and resurrection, after all. He already knows the outcome of the struggle between Pilate and the priests. He knows he will die, and he knows there will be resurrection on the other side. And yet I can't help but wonder, as he struggled up the hill with a heavy weight on his already bleeding back, even as he knew that God was with him, that God had the power to resurrect him, that his body would be restored to come back and reign in glory, if he also doubted that there was anything on the other side of this death at all. As I imagine the story, with each step Jesus takes, he knows and he doubts. He knows and he doubts. And I know and I doubt. I know God is with me and will be with me on the other side of this. And I doubt that there will be any life on the other side of this at all. How can there be when all I see is the loss right in front of me? And yet I know God is faithful even beyond death. I know that in whatever loss I face, God is right there, grieving with me. That Jesus has walked each of these holy steps beside me. I know that no matter what happens in my nation and my world, no matter what destructive decisions the powers that be make, God is still working behind the scenes. I know that my God is a God of new life after death. And I know that ultimately, God's promise of making all things new, of resurrection and wholeness and justice, will be fulfilled. It is in this place of knowing, even under the burden of the heavy cross of death and loss, that I can continue to step forward, one foot at a time, one holy step at a time. Not frantic to change the outcome or to control circumstances that are far out of my control, not to take responsibility for the choices of others, but trusting in a God who is far bigger than any of the powers I see around me, a God that is not frantic in times when I feel powerless. I can know that this God is king, and that these other powers and even the empires they serve are not. And so I can trust that God will have the final say. Amen.